Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Agronomists. I am your host, Lyndsey Smith, and I am pretty excited for tonight's topic. I jokingly called it weird bugs, but of course, not all insects are bugs, and not all bugs are insects. I mean, all bugs are insects. Oh my goodness, this is going to be so much fun. Before I bring in tonight's guest, of course, I do want to remind everybody for heading on over to realagriculture.com/agronomist. Head on over there starting tomorrow morning. Make sure you let us know you watch the broadcast and make sure you get those CEU credits for following along with this show. Super important. Please do that. And good evening to so many of you already in the comments. Really appreciate that. Apparently, we're having a bit of a hiccup on Twitter. So if you've got friends trying to join from Twitter, just send them to YouTube or to Facebook. They can watch it there. Or, of course, that website I just mentioned. But hello to Mark, Warren's here, Ray, Kevin, Jason. Oh, Jason, I have a secret. Our guests are not in the prairies right now. All right. Yes, my voice is back mostly. It is taking its jolly sweet time coming back entirely, Warren, but thanks. Yes, Chris was very happy. Okay, of course, our show is brought to you by our show sponsors, who we are very pleased to have on. So a big thank you to Decisive Farming by Telus Agriculture, the Disruptors, CanolaMaster, and ADAMA Canada. By listening to you and remaining unapologetically crop protection, we leverage the world's largest library of actives to provide innovative solutions to your greatest challenges. Tell your ADAMA sales representative what you're looking for today. Okay, it is time for the topic. It is lesser weevils, maybe? Some lesser known pests. This episode is somewhat inspired by Mark, who's on here. So thank you to Mark. And I shall bring in my guests joining us from Vancouver. We have doctors John Gavloski and James Tansey. Welcome here, John and James.
Good evening.
Thank you, Lyndsey.
Alrighty. So, yes, Jason, that's right. They're joining us from Vancouver. Thank you very much. These two are joining us from, correct me if I get this wrong, it's a conference of the Entomological Societies of Canada, America, and British Columbia. Did I get it right?
You got it.
Got it right. Everyone, there are over 3,000 entomologists in Vancouver right now. So, oh my goodness, imagine. I can just imagine the side conversations that happen at lunch. Okay. All right. And so tonight, so thank you to both for taking time out of your conference. I do really appreciate it. But tonight we're going to talk about perhaps some of the lesser known pests, some of the up and comers, and of course, some of those very familiar ones that just bear mentioning all the time. John, I'll start with you. What was your biggest surprise on the pest front this year in Manitoba?
Crickets, I would say. And the reason being, I mean, we've had high cricket numbers for a while, but they usually don't damage field crops to any significant extent. But this year, we had a lot of late seeding. It was very wet. People were seeding late. And we actually had some fairly significant cricket feeding happening on canola pods, cereal heads, flax bowls. Now, I've seen them on flax before, so that's not new, but not to the extent that we saw this year. The canola pods, I've never seen crickets feeding directly into canola pods before. So that was certainly a surprise for me. And there was some edge spraying of canola fields to control crickets. Well, often it was a combination, crickets and grasshoppers, but seeing that cricket feeding to the extent that it was occurring on the crops. And I think it was just the perfect storm of the crops being late and there being a lot of crickets.
Yeah, absolutely. So Kevin says 3,000 entomologists is an infestation. James, it's actually a swarm. I'm pretty sure. Anyway, all right. So, James, same question for you. Saskatchewan had a slightly different growing season than Manitoba, but a challenging one nonetheless. Were there any pest surprises this year for you?
I would say one of the big surprises was because of the cool, wet spring that we had in large parts of the province. We weren't anticipating flea beetles to be as prevalent as they were. We expected with the delayed seeding in large parts of the province that they might escape some of that damage, but with the cool wet spring, it seems the flea beetle synchronization with the seedling emergence was pretty strong, and we saw some pretty heavy damage.
I just don't know that there's any way away from those flea beetles, to be honest. They were terrible everywhere. And we will get into a bit more of that in a bit. I did want to mention, so Kevin notes that this week is the 1 year anniversary of that atmospheric river that hit the Fraser Valley. And I can't believe it's been a year either, Kevin. And that's, very much from an outsider's perspective. So kind of fitting that we're streaming from Vancouver this week. So, yeah. Okay, so let's dig into some of the lesser known or perhaps up and coming type pests that we want to get into. And I'm going to throw a bit of a curveball, perhaps, John, although I don't think I can surprise you with anything. But the two of you did send some wonderful slides, some great pictures, some insects we have to talk about. One I had never heard of before, so that's the first one I'm going to ask about, is the beet webworm. What on earth is a beet webworm? What does it eat? Should I be incredibly afraid? Because I kind of am.
Okay, well, the name gives you some clues of what they eat. They will eat beet leaves and sugar beet leaves. That's how they get their name. But they've actually got a very broad host range, which includes at times things like canola, flax, and more recently quinoa is another host plant on the prairies we've seen them feeding on. Now, when they feed, they're initially it almost looks like diamondback moth feeding. It's You get this shot holing in the leaves when they're young, where they basically make a little window in the leaf. Usually, they're feeding on the underside. They make a window, and as they get bigger, they're taking bigger chunks out of the leaves. You get this very ragged appearance, some skeletonizing. So that's what they do. And they do have the same habit as diamondback moth, where if you disturb them, especially when they're young, they'll dangle from a thread. So that's a behavioral characteristic that can help with ID. But appearance-wise, as they get bigger, they become more of, instead of being so much green, it's almost like a olive green or yellowy green. And they've got these, if you look at them carefully, they're covered in dots with a black center and a white rim. So they're easy enough to tell apart from something like a diamondback moth. They're not a common or major pest of canola or flax, or for the most part quinoa, but they're one of these sporadic occasional things that every now and then populations get high and they become an issue. Now, the other thing I should mention when we're talking about what they eat, they also like feeding on lamb's quarters, pigweed, Russian thistle, a lot of weeds. And they really like lamb's quarters. So if there's a lot of lamb's quarters around or in a field, that's likely where they're going to be. Now, if the lamb's quarters is controlled, they're going to be hungry and they're going to move on to there we go. There's our photo. So they'll move on to other hosts if their favorites are controlled. And quinoa is a very close relative to lamb's quarters, so they do have an appetite for that. So here you can see, again, that kind of yellowish green color, mixture of dark and lighter stripes and the dots with the kind of white outer circle and the black in the middle.
So I love, John, that you say it would be easy to tell. But let's be honest, we have to learn what they look like. It's not easy for everybody. We have to actually train our eyes to do these things. And Ray suggests, speaking of training, could we train them to eat kosher? What do you think?
Oh, good question, Ray. And I wouldn't be surprised if it's already part of their diet. They've got a very broad host range. Whether it's one of their favorites or not, I'm not sure. But hey, we'll genetically modify beet webworms to eat kosher. There we go.
If you could, that would be great. So James, I'm going to guess you've seen this then in Saskatchewan?
Yeah, I was going to add we've been we're just winding down a 2 year pretty intensive survey of quinoa insects in Saskatchewan, and thanks to John for contributing Manitoba data for that, and to Boyd Morey in Alberta for contributing Alberta data. to that. But we saw pretty heavy pressure of beet webworm in a lot of canola growing, quinoa growing areas,
Yeah.
along with clover cutworm this year. Um, it is arguably one of the major pests of quinoa, and there are actually control products registered to control these animals in quinoa, including Dipel and BioProtec.
Okay. So we actually have some options. This is one I'd never heard of, and I'm smarter already, and we're 10 minutes in. Ray Domenko adds there are over 3,000 entomologists in one spot. Solve this problem by the end of the week. There you go. And then,
Okay.
maybe move on to the bigger ones. But start small. Do something, focused. Okay, let's move on. James, let's talk about thrips, because thrips is, and producer Jay, I think it's the first slide of James's slides. I love the word thrip. I like what thrip damage looks like. And so I apologize to anyone who's had a thrip problem, because I think they're just fun. But anyway, what do I need to know about barley thrips?
Well, first of all, singular thrips, plural thrips. It's a little bit like moose. Yep.
Uh,
Yep. So,
so, okay.
yeah, cereal thrips, including barley thrips. So there's another species of thrips that can be important in cereals as well. Primarily important in barley. We saw some pressure last year and a fair bit of spray going down, both in barley and in durum. Uh, the thresholds for barley are relatively well understood, both from North American and from European data. And there is a formula for determining that, and that is your expected control cost, so dollar per acre, divided by your expected bushel price, so dollar per bushel, divided by 0.4. It just so happens under current conditions that usually winds up being about 7 to 8 per stem. So they're important from flag leaf until the head is complete, or the head emergence is complete, and control shouldn't be inflicted past that point. So once the head is out, any damage that's going to accumulate with these animals has already been done. Where we're so as I mentioned before, so the relationship with barley pretty well understood, and the damage associated with these populations at these levels less well understood with durum, both from North American and from European data. So there's as much data from the European data set to indicate that, yeah, they can be a problem, as no. They can also be damaging in oats as well. So
Okay. So one of the things that I'm not only going to choose my favorites, everyone, but really, I'm the host. I can do that if I really want. But one of the things, yes, we're going to talk about some of the lesser known, but I do want to bring in a few of these questions, because we've already hit on a few of the key points here on, knowing what crops they damage, but also knowing what other host crops, or what other crops act as hosts, so that, like in the instance where, lamb's quarters could be providing food and shelter for some of these insects. And then I do want to talk about, of course, rotation and weather. And because, of course, insect pests always, we've talked about sawfly and we've talked about wheat midge. And, for some pests, rotation really matters. And for others, really, you're at the whim of weather. Anyway, so I am going to switch gears in just a moment to go to our first clip, and to sort of talk about some of these multi-year management options. But Peter Johnson has a question: do thrips ever reach threshold in hard red spring wheat? Is, I think, what he meant to say. Yes,
yeah,
it
no,
is what he meant to say.
oh, sure. Yeah, I'll defer to my previous comment where the relationship in wheat isn't as well understood as it is in barley.
Okay.
With
Yeah.
barley, it's pretty well understood. The response of the plant to that level of feeding, less well understood in wheat. But we did have damaging levels last year in durum that required chemical control. It's not impossible that they could cause damage, but the relationship isn't as strong as you might see with barley.
Okay. John, have you seen, do thrips, or is there a thrip species that attacks canola? Yeah, there is.
Yes, we've got flower thrips that will feed in canola. Well, there's more than just one type, actually.
Yeah.
There's been surveys,
Yeah.
and you can actually find a few types. But some of the flower thrips are the main ones that are most abundant. Whether they're economical or not, Owen Olfert with Ag Canada and Saskatchewan, he tried to do a study to determine, is there a threshold? How economical are they? And he did have some fairly high numbers in his study, but he never did have a threshold. He basically concluded it can be very visible at times, but not highly economical. Now, one thing you might see in the field, if you've had a lot of thrips in canola, they will feed on the young pods, and they do preferentially feed on that upper surface. And the pod will actually curl almost like a curly fry, and you get these curled pods on the plant. So that's one symptom of thrips feeding. You still do have seeds inside. Yield might be reduced a bit, but for the most part, it's probably not highly economical in canola. Not to the same extent that barley thrips can be in barley and maybe to some degree wheat.
All right. So Peter adds that here in Ontario you can see high numbers in wheat, but rarely see much yield impact. So there you go. It's one of those that tolerates it quite well then, let's say. Okay, and Mark adds, we see thrips occasionally in soybeans, very visible, but don't treat them. And that was at V3, V4. So interesting to see how different crops manage with them. Very cool. Okay, let's head on over because we're going to rapidly run out of time if we don't keep moving. So we're going to head to our first clip, and this is a Corn School episode with Bern Tobin, Amanda Graven, and we're going to talk about corn rootworm in this clip, Jay.
One of the things we've heard a lot about this year, corn rootworm. Talk about resistance. How do we manage it? Rotation. What have you seen this year? What's happening in the fields, as I say, you've been walking?
It's a great question, Bern. So what we're seeing this year in our corn-on-corn fields where we have above ground protection only, we are seeing a lot of goosenecking. We saw some root pruning earlier on, and now we're seeing rather large numbers of adult corn rootworms. In some situations, both northern and southern.
Right. What about, I guess, the situation with, corn on corn versus well-rotated land and well-rotated crops? Distinct difference there?
Yeah, I would say today in Ontario, we are still for the most part lucky that our above and below ground traits are holding up. That is this year, that is today. And so the big conversation is around what can we do to try to mitigate losing those? What do we need to do as producers so that we can keep using this technology to our own benefit?
Yeah, and one of the things, obviously, we talked about corn on corn, and you've got in this plot here some real evidence of what happens when we're doing corn on corn. Take us through this plot, Amanda. What are we seeing?
Yeah, absolutely. So what we're seeing here today is a rather high population of corn rootworm adults. We saw a lot of larvae feeding earlier on. There's a lot of goosenecking in here, a lot of root pruning, unfortunately. We have a G2, which is above ground only, and G8, which is above and below, side by side. And the evidence or the difference is clear as day. Yeah. We have full rows that are goosenecked versus full rows that are standing tall, which is great, but it also shows the importance of why we need to preserve this technology.
Exactly. And talk about yield impact here. In this situation where you have such high levels of damage, what type of impact are we looking at?
Yeah, surely where we have plants completely gooseneck over and not even throwing a viable cob, the yield loss there is pretty big. We can expect nothing from that plant. Tracy Bowdy and Jocelyn Smith have done some great work to try to quantify what root pruning will do to a crop. So they've found that when even something as small as one node is lost, you can expect 15 to 18% of yield loss in that plant.
So let's talk about the future here and our plans going forward. Anything we can do this fall to mitigate this situation? Should we be out there scouting and making sure we know where hot spots maybe are in their field or where corn rootworm has set down some roots?
Yeah, absolutely. So we still have some important information we can gather out of this year. There are still adults flying around doing their thing. Although what's lost is lost at this point, it is important to be able to walk into the field and try to understand what's going on today so that we can track that as through the next few seasons and see, are we progressing? Is the technology holding where we'd like to see it? For this year, what the damage is done. However, we can still learn some things for next year.
Yeah, so talk about next year. I know Tracy Bowdy and Jocelyn have been doing a lot of work on the trapping network. Tell me about what you're telling your clients and what they're telling us overall.
Yeah, in general, it's really important to know what's going on in the field. So nothing replaces getting out there and taking a look at the crop. If you have corn on corn where you've planted the appropriate variety that has above and below ground protection, and you're seeing adults out there, or you're seeing root pruning, that's a big problem. That's the kind of thing that people need to know about, because that's very concerning for the whole industry, seeing as we don't have a lot of tools sitting in the toolbox to back us up.
Yeah. So should we be counting beetles in this next year? Talk a little bit about that trapping approach.
Yeah, so absolutely. About end of July, get some sticky traps out there. It's important to maybe, once a week go out there, do a count, see what you're dealing with, and report it. It's good to try to learn how to identify your southern versus northern. Southern being your yellow and black stripe, and your northern being more of that bright green beetle.
All right. During that, I was furiously writing down all the points that I wanted to bring up from that quick video. But before I put some of that to our guests, I did, of course, want to send another shout out to our sponsors tonight: ADAMA Canada, Decisive Farming by Telus Agriculture, The Disruptors, an RBC podcast, and CanolaMaster. We call ourselves CanolaMaster because we want every canola grower to achieve growing perfection. Master your canola with the 160 Acres of Gold giveaway. Enter today at CanolaMaster.ca. Conditions apply. All right. So there are a few things in that video I want to touch on. Not even specifically about corn rootworm, but we can certainly touch on that. But mentioning in there, of course, scouting, proper ID, and trapping as well. So, John, I'll start with you. The role of trapping, because of course, we can trap certain things. Some we have pheromone traps for some, we have sticky traps for others. How important is it to be monitoring what's going on in our fields from an insect perspective?
Well, if we're just talking in general, insects, extremely important, of course. For decision-making purposes, you have to know what's going on, both potential pest insects, beneficial insects. Is anything approaching a threshold? So in general, scouting is extremely important, and that's why people need to be out looking, or have a good agronomist who's out looking. It can pay dividends many times over. Now, in the case of corn rootworm, you can either look for larvae or you can look for adults. Looking for larvae is difficult. It means digging up roots and looking for root pruning or root damage, which can be done, but it takes a bit of work. Looking for adults, which is not the damaging stage, but it's something that can help you prepare for the next year. And what I would advise is, if you've been growing corn for any more than about 2 years in a row, it's not a bad idea to be putting out a series of those sticky cards that were shown. So that's the western corn rootworm in the photo that you've pulled up. So I'm just going to make a correction here. It was referred to as northern and southern corn rootworm in that clip, but it's actually northern and western corn rootworm that are the two species that we have here. And so this one, the yellow and black one, that's the western corn rootworm, which we found for the first time in 2021. And this is the northern corn rootworm, which is green, sometimes almost a yellowy. And this one in Manitoba, we know it's right across southern Manitoba. We've had that for, we first found it in 2015, but we've probably had it for longer than that. And we have seen, I've seen fields, both in central and western Manitoba, where the goosenecking that was shown in that video was very extensive. There was a field in central Manitoba here where they were really struggling with how they were going to harvest it. It was a silage field. And basically what had happened is the plants had lost so much root material. They had fallen over, but they were still live plants. They were still growing, but they grow with a curved stem. That's what we call the goosenecking, is that curved stem. But when you get a lot of that, it makes harvesting that crop very difficult. we have seen that in Manitoba, but only in fields that were corn year after year after year after year. People who aren't rotating their corn, that's the only place we see this. So rotation is your number one means of controlling this. Now, if you are persistent in growing corn on corn on corn on corn on corn, one thing you can do is put those yellow sticky traps out in late July or August, as the video suggested. Check them weekly. If you're getting any more than about 2 or 3 of the adult beetles per day per trap, then you might want to consider either rotating, using some of the BT corn that targets rootworms, or some other method of management. But one thing to note, there's BT corn for European corn borer, BT corn for corn rootworm, and BT corn for both. So don't assume that any BT corn you plant controls rootworm. Make sure the rootworm trait is on it if you are wanting rootworm control. Don't make that assumption. And in the prairies here, there's really not a lot of hybrids that have that rootworm protection because our growing season's a bit shorter. Most of the hybrids with rootworm protection require a bit longer growing season. So you've only got a few options.
Okay.
Yeah,
So,
if I,
yeah, go ahead, James. Yeah, I was going to
oh, so
ask.
yeah,
Yeah, go ahead.
if I could just add, I mean, yeah, John raises some excellent points, and one is the importance of rotation with some pests, and this is an excellent example. These animals aren't terrific long distance flyers, so I mean, corn on corn on corn can really contribute to increases. We're not currently under pressure from this animal in Saskatchewan, but Manitoba is experiencing that. We're anticipating it, so I think that's probably another point. And monitoring, as he mentioned before, and I think that's an important point for all insects, and monitoring with the tools that you have available, whether that's sweeping or sampling, otherwise sticky cards, pheromone traps where available, and knowing what you have in a particular crop is essential.
Mm-hmm. And a really key point there about matching the trait to the pest. Excuse me for one thing, my voice is still not back. And managing that resistance as well. So Peter asked if there are issues with rootworm resistance issues in the West. So John, have you seen any of that as of yet?
No, not in the West, not in Western Canada, but Ontario, yes, it's something
Yeah.
that they're starting to struggle with and deal with. Part of the problem there is people have been using the rootworm resistant corn, which again can be a good practice. But the problem is people were using the rootworm resistant corn year after year after year, and insects are really good at overcoming the resistance genes. If you're applying the same selection pressure on them year after year after year, they're going to overcome it eventually. And I was at a talk actually at this meeting yesterday, and one of the entomologists who studies corn rootworm used the analogy of imagine you've got your Tim Hortons card and you've got so many free coffees. You start using them up. Now you can use all of them up in one day. It might not be a lot of drinking of coffee, or you can make that card last a month, a year. It's totally up to you. And the same thing can apply to the resistant corn hybrids. If you're using them when you don't need to be using them, you're checking off what you've got on that card. So the advice is monitor. Put up those sticky cards. Know what the levels are like. If the adult counts in the fall suggest you should be doing something, do something. If they suggest you don't need to, don't. And if there's any way you can work it in, just rotate your crop. Just get it out of corn for a year. These are tiny little, they overwinter as eggs, and they hatch out as tiny larvae in the spring that only eat corn roots. If there's no corn in that field, they starve. So rotate your crops and starve a rootworm.
There you go. That should be a shirt. Okay, let's switch gears a little bit. James, I want to talk about not Swede midge. It has a name now. So I think, yeah. So what are we talking about here? Is the canola flower midge? Jay, if
Yeah.
you can bring up, I think it's slide 4. What are we looking at? What do we know about this pest?
So this is Contarinea brassicola. So it's in the same genus as Swede midge, but it
Okay.
is not Swede midge. Yeah, if you the adults are tiny. You can see they look a little bit like a mosquito. They're in the same sort of broad group of lower flies as mosquitoes. So superficially, they look like mosquitoes. Absolutely not Swede midge. We do not have Swede midge on the prairies to date. But this is one that's thought to be a native species. And it's taking advantage of canola, and it's another what are called gall midges. So the family are called cessids or Cessidemyiidae. Big long word. But yeah, cessids for short. They're called the gall midges, much like Swede midge. So what they specialize in is causing the growth of undifferentiated tissue. So you can see this pretty conspicuous bell shape on the canola flowers here. And there's another slide for this animal as well, if you can put that up. And
The next
I
one,
think
I
it's a
think.
close up of some pods. What was reported several years ago, and came to light again last year, and a little bit this year, is we were getting reports of their larvae actually inside the canola pods. And in increasing numbers, particularly in northern canola growing regions. Are they economic at this point? No. We've only had one account of a probable economic population. No products registered for their control. But if you do see these conspicuous little orange wigglers inside your canola pods, it's very likely that you're looking at canola flower midge. Um, Not to be confused with cabbage seed pod weevil, which you'll also see inside a pod. Cabbage seed pod weevils for your you Highlander fans in the crowd. There can be only one. They don't like each other's company, and they're cannibalistic. So you see one thing, probably looking at a weevil larvae. You see a whole bunch of little orange guys. It's probably canola flower midge.
Oh my goodness, there can only be one. That is pretty fantastic. I like it. I feel like there needs to be another one of those battles, right? The what was it? The arena of death with the pests. John knows what I'm talking about.
Mhm.
Anyway, oh, Jason has a question. Ooh, that's how it begins. We should talk about soybean gall midge. So if we've opened up the discussion of gall midges, thank you, Dr. Tansey. Tell me about soybean gall midge
We don't see that in Saskatchewan, so I
at
have very
all.
little experience with it. Yeah,
Okay, John, what
John,
about
any
you?
Well,
experience
okay.
with it?
Yeah, a few comments here. Now, first of all, we don't have soybean gall midge here in Manitoba. It has been
Okay.
found in the U.S. and several states. Um, it still hasn't made it into kind of the northern parts of Minnesota, North Dakota, Manitoba. So it's further south. Now, so what soybean gall midge does is it's feeding very low on the stem and right in the stem, and you get this kind of rotted out area on the stem, which can be economical. Often there's a very heavy edge effect associated with it. And we do encourage soybean growers and agronomists, if you do think you see this, let us know. It's possible that it is here. We just haven't found it. So do let us know if you think you've seen it. I'd be really interested. However, there's always a however. We do have other midges that will feed on
Yeah.
soybean stems and canola stems. And they're orange, just like that canola flower midge that Jim showed up on the flowers and in the pods. There's other midge larvae that look exactly like that and can be found on the stems. Now, usually the stems are diseased. In canola, it's usually sclerotinia, and sometimes in the pulse crops as well, soybeans, it can be, if you get sclerotinia and you've got that white, any kind of mold growing on the plants, there's midges that feed on the molds.
Yeah.
And they're basically belong to the same group of midges, but they're fungus feeding ones, not plant feeding ones. this is where entomology gets complicated, and you need 3,000 of us.
That's right. That's why you all have jobs. Yeah.
So that's right. There's just, we need more entomologists. Too many bugs. But yes, so there's midges that will feed on the molds growing on plant stems. And I have had a few people send me photos of and specimens of orange midge that they found on soybean stems and canola stems. So far, they've all been these fungus feeding midge. So if you find it living in and feeding on a diseased part of the plant, it probably is these fungus feeding ones. But if you're not quite sure, again, get them sent in. One cautionary note, though, trying to determine soybean gall midge from these fungus feeding ones based on just the larva is really, really tricky. So if I get a vial with some orange larva in it, to eyeball it and say it's soybean gall midge, it's not that easy. I'd likely have to rear them out and get the adults. Then we can tell. And then you're looking at things like antenna and stuff like that to figure all this out. But midges are a big, some of these gall midges, it's a huge group. They feed on lots of things.
Yeah, and even the adults are really difficult to tell apart. I mean, you're looking at the tiny little animal, tiny little clubs on their antennae, and you're looking at little points on the antennae to be able to tell some of the species apart. So it takes a real expert eye and a lot of time. We've got some molecular techniques, including barcoding, that really go a long way towards helping us to tease apart some of these species. And as a matter of fact, canola flower midge was first detected through these molecular techniques. It was thought it may be if not sweet midge, then big question mark. Then it was assessed with these molecular techniques, and it was there's something else going on here. So
okay, so that was actually one of my questions, was if that's how, because I know it was up in the air for a little while as to whether or not it was. So I wanted to know how we sort of determined, with an absolute that that's what it was. So yes, it was from a molecular standpoint. I just want to observe. Yeah.
Sorry.
That,
sorry. I don't mean
go
to.
Go ahead. No, go ahead, James.
Yeah. There is always a big however, and I think the molecular techniques can illustrate that you're maybe going down the wrong path, but oftentimes with these kinds of animals, you're still looking at doing things the old-fashioned way, morphologically, and there's really no replacement for an expert eye. So.
Yeah, absolutely. So Ray says entomologists use the word however, like soil scientists use it depends. Yeah. So there you go. There is always a however. Which I think is fantastic. Okay, we're going to switch gears a little bit. We're going to go to our next and last clip with Megan Van Koski. We're going to look at cabbage seed pod weevil. Jay, if we can go to our next clip.
We're going to talk about scouting for cabbage seed pod weevil. Now, farmers are out in their field and they're looking for the insect. What are they looking for?
So the best way to look for cabbage seed pod weevil is actually to sweep for them. And so you're going to find them in the upper canopy of the plant, because at this time of year, as the flowers are starting and the buds are coming out, the weevils are going to be laying eggs into the flowers and into the pods. So you want to sweep at the level of the foliage and the flowers, and then check your net to see if you've got any cabbage seed pod weevil. They're pretty small, they're hard to see, and they like to drop and play dead as well. That's a weevil trick. All weevils, if they're disturbed, they'll play dead and fall to the ground or fall away from where they are. So the best way to find them is with a sweep net.
So what time of the day are you going to be looking out for the weevil?
Well, everyone kind of has a different opinion. People don't like to sweep when it's wet because it gets their nets wet, so to avoid the morning dew. But at this time of morning, in a nice calm day, or when it's getting warmer into that like 15 to 20 degree range, they'll be active and active in that canopy area. So go out and sweep at that time of day. And really all through the afternoon should be fine as well.
And time of the year, you said they like flowers. So do you tend to only see them out and about at flowering?
So you're going to find the adults as the plants are starting to bolt and as they're starting to flower, because again, they are looking to lay eggs into the pods or into the developing buds. So when you're looking for adults, that's definitely the time. We go out to scout fields for the Prairie Pest Monitoring Network when plants or when fields are in that 10 to 20% flower range.
And damage, if you're seeing them feeding, what can they actually do to that final yield number?
Right, so the adults will feed on the foliage, so you'll find maybe some chewing damage on the leaves lower down in the canopy. But the real damage to the yield comes from the larvae, and they're actually going to feed inside the pods. So you'd have to be opening up pods to try to find the larvae. Probably not the best use of time. So you're not going to find the larvae easily, but they're the ones who are doing the damage because they're actually eating the developing seeds inside the pod. And then at the end of their development, they chew a hole to leave the pod, and that exit hole weakens the pod, so then you can actually have more shatter during harvest and more seed loss during harvest. So it's the larval damage that we're really concerned about for yield.
So many good things out of that one too. Of course, before we get going with our discussion here, another thank you to our sponsors tonight, ADAMA Canada, the Disruptors, CanolaMaster, and Decisive Farming. Your soil has a unique story at Decisive Farming by Telus Agriculture. We get that. See the bigger picture by digging into your field's performance today. Remember, ROI is only a portion of the equation. Visit decisivefarming.com. I am having a heck of a time with website addresses today. I apologize. Okay, Gord has a great question that I want to get to, but first I do want to review a couple things on the seed pod weevil, the cabbage seed pod weevil. So Jay, if you can bring up, I think it is slide 2, I believe. So, Dr. Tansey, let's just go over a bit more. We'll build off of what Megan had said there. This one seems to be one that is growing in population.
Yeah, it is invasive. So I mean, its range both eastward and northward is expanding. We had some reports of spraying in the southwest of Saskatchewan and throughout Alberta, and pretty heavy populations in southern Alberta this year. So it's now in Manitoba. Although John, with your monitoring, you've detected only very low numbers. We've concluded our survey for Saskatchewan for this year, but we're crunching the numbers on that. So I do have some pictures of some of our survey data from this past period and maybe a previous period too.
Yeah, that's the next slide, I think, Jay.
Yeah, so you can see from 2020, 2020 to 2021. I think the 2021 data may be a little bit misleading for the populations in southern Saskatchewan. There was a lot of red in Alberta, and we had a pretty significant drought in the southwest of Saskatchewan last year, and a lot of the canola crops that would be their host plants really suffered under those conditions. I mean, we're talking foot tall canola that was brown and crispy, so really not very good as a host plant for these animals. So hard to find the animals if the host plant is in poor condition. That and the survey was conducted a little bit later than it might normally be. But you can still see, we've got that movement northward, we've got that movement eastward, or the concentrations of them. Did a little modeling on these animals and their spread, and it seems there is a connection between snow cover and hard winter temperatures. So they're not as cold hardy as some other animals, so they're super cooling temperature, and that's what this is all depends on. They can depress their super cooling temperature, so that is, it's not 0 degrees Celsius, the free solid. They can actually depress that to about -8, -10 degrees, but that's actually pretty wimpy by prairie standards. I mean, so so I mean, so a lot of the animals that evolved in this climate are a little bit more cold hardy than these ones. Same thing with pea leaf weevil; it's not terribly cold hardy. So those periods of little snow cover with really cold temperatures. I mean, everyone remembers the really significant cold snaps that we seem to get every year with the collapse of the polar vortex. But these do seem to have an impact on it. Megan Van Koski, who we saw in that clip there, she's also looking at soil moisture for pea leaf weevil, and so it's probably not all of one factor or all of another factor, but there are some things that are contributing to the success of these animals and to their spread or restricting their spread. But yeah, we had economic populations in northern regions both last year and this year of cabbage seed pod weevil. So
Yeah, so this dovetails beautifully into Gord's question, and I swear to God I didn't set this up. But Gord's question is, as pest species show up and survive in more northern areas or outside of where they're maybe introduced or native to, do you see or expect beneficials to move with them eventually? So this example with the weevils is learning about exactly that. Are they winter hardy? Is there a soil moisture component? Is there a snow cover component? But it's not just about their food. It's also the whole chain that sort of goes with them. So this is maybe a general question, but if you have any examples, I'll put this to both of you. When we see a new pest expanding its range, how long does it take for the beneficials to sort of come along, or do they even come along?
well, I can address the beginning of that, and then I'll turn it over to John. So what we're talking about is called the enemy release hypothesis. So it's kind of an overarching principle for how invasive species become invasive. So they show up in a new place, and they don't have that list of natural enemies that would normally regulate their populations. So they're no longer bounded by that. The populations can increase, and the range can further expand without those natural enemies. And that's one of the big principles for classical biological control, where you're reintroducing specialists of those pests to control their populations. And we've seen some really good examples both in classical insect biological control and classical weed biocontrol, where you're reintroducing their natural enemies from their native range. Now I'll pass it over to John.
Okay, John, your turn. Yeah.
Sure, and yeah, an awesome example of classic biological control is cereal leaf beetle.
Yeah.
So cereal leaf beetle, it moved into Manitoba. Year one that we found it in Manitoba, we started releasing a parasitoid called Tetrastitchus julis. So very tiny black parasitic wasp. And as the cereal leaf beetle population expanded, we were surveying for it. Anytime we found a new population for several years, we did a new release of this parasitoid. Eventually, we stopped doing our releases. The cereal leaf beetle kept expanding, and we were finding the parasitoid quite a long ways away from where we did any of our releases. Once we got the parasitoid going, it seemed to spread with the cereal leaf beetle. Now, we've got cereal leaf beetle pretty much right across anywhere that grows wheat, or not just wheat, oats, barley, cereal crops in Manitoba. We've got cereal leaf beetle now. The furthest east that I've been able to do releases is the Carmen area. So Carmen West is where I was able to do releases. After that, the parasitoids ran out and I wasn't able to get any more. However, I still was collecting larvae, and they were being dissected to see if there were parasitoid larvae inside. And some of the areas in the eastern part of the province where we didn't do releases anywhere near had parasitoid levels anywhere from about 30 to 50% in the larva. And to my knowledge, there hasn't been any spraying for cereal leaf beetle in Manitoba. It's been here for quite a while. You can find it if you look for it in the cereal fields, but in most cases, it's not at levels that we consider economical. And I think the main reason is that parasitoid that got released, got established, and seems to be following the spread of cereal leaf beetle.
I think another really good example of a natural enemy. Sorry, go ahead.
No,
sorry.
go ahead,
Another,
James. I'll
yeah.
ask after you. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, sorry. Another really good example of a natural enemy or a parasitoid following its host is diamondback moth. So this animal is migratory, so it overwinters in southern parts of the United States where it's feeding on winter brassicaceous crops, or broccoli and cabbage. When the thinking is when those crops are harvested, they'll take flight and move north. Much like migratory birds do. So it's thought that diadegma, as one of their primary parasitoids, actually follows them from these southern ranges because it doesn't overwinter very well here. Neither does diamondback moth. So there seems to be this train of pest and parasitoid.
So I'm being a little bit tongue in cheek, but not really. Is there like an Amazon type online ordering system where I can be like, I have this pest, I would like its parasitoid, please send it to me?
Yes, there is.
If you're
There
a
are.
greenhouse grower, yes.
Yeah.
So okay, so for a greenhouse grower, yes, which I have seen some of that here around Ottawa. I've seen some of they have an issue with white flies, I think it is, and so they have sort of a release for the white flies. So that's really neat. But of course, we're talking broadacre, so it has happened, it does exist, but obviously, I mean, we are talking at a scale that's significantly different than greenhouses.
Yeah,
Very
and
much so.
that's the ultimate issue is just
Mhm.
the sheer size of field production in Canada. So and
Yeah,
of pest populations.
most releases in field crops, it's researchers who are trying to get something established and hope that it spreads. But commercially, we just don't have farmers and agronomists buying thousands of Tetrastitchus julis or parasitoids for cabbage seed pod weevil. First of all, they're not available in bulk quantities for most of our field crop pests, and it's just not practical. It works very well in an enclosed system like a greenhouse when you've got aphids, whiteflies, thrips, fungus gnats. Works awesome, and it's kind of the go-to for some of those pests in greenhouses. But yeah, field crops, very different system, and the best we can do is try to get some established and hope that they spread. But
Yeah.
annual releases, it's just we're not at that point.
Yeah, a number of parasitoids have been released for cabbage seed pod weevil, and some of them have become established. Their impact on populations not as strong to date, but there is still hope for biological control of that pest in particular. So
Okay. And I know there is some work here in Ontario using some nematodes and the pest escapes me right now. But so some of this does actually, it does actually happen. So we have two things, and I would be remiss if I didn't bring up flea beetles. So Jason, thank you for the reminder. Jason laments that we cannot keep spraying like we are for flea beetles. So,
true.
and we are reducing beneficial populations when we do spray. I do feel like we are at a juncture on flea beetles. So where are we at? James, you want to jump in here? Are we hurting our beneficials?
Yeah, I think where we're with flea beetles, it's a difficult conundrum because it's such a numbers game. There's just so many flea beetles that come up in the spring that the potential impact of natural enemies is likely not significant. I'd like natural enemies. Certainly, there are a number of different critters that will feed on flea beetles. My greater worry is seeing what some European jurisdictions are seeing, and that is the evolution of insecticide resistance. Because the foliar application, if the seed dressing doesn't do what the grower is hoping, they're typically going to hit it with a group 3 insecticide or a synthetic pyrethroid. Because the Europeans have lost neonics for a number of different purposes, they're seeing emergence of group 3 resistance in their flea beetle populations, as well as cabbage seed pod weevil and pollen beetle. We haven't seen it to date in Western Canada, and Boyd Morey's postdoc is actually working on that right now, and her work indicates that there isn't an indication of group 3 resistance in our flea beetle populations. So I've sent her beetles. I'm sure, John, you've probably sent her bags of beetles in the mail, and Alberta populations as well. So to date, no resistance demonstrated in those animals, but boy, the selective pressure sure there. I mean, we keep hitting them with that hammer. It's
Yeah. John, your thoughts?
Yeah, so just as a heads up too, we will be collecting flea beetles next year as well to get them sent in for this resistance testing. And I'd like to get flea beetles from various parts of the province. So for agronomists, I might be giving you a call or an email at some point asking if you can donate some of the flea beetles from some of your fields to science and have them tested for insecticide resistance. But yeah, flea beetles, I know people want a silver bullet answer, and I totally agree with Jason. In Manitoba this year, we had farmers putting down as many as 4 or 5 foliar insecticides, and that's in addition to the seed treatment that was on the plant. I'm even aware of situations where people had their seed treatment, did multiple foliar insecticides, and still had to reseed. So big issue. But those multiple foliar applications, yes, they're broad spectrum sprays. They're either a pyrethroid or carbaryl, they're all broad spectrum. So they're basically killing off whatever is in the area. One of the talks I was at yesterday, we were talking about the role of ground beetles in reducing weed seed populations. So ground beetles, big, huge group of beetles. One of the things that some of the species feed on is weed seeds. When you wipe all those out, well, less things feeding on your weed seeds. But in addition, many species of ground beetles are awesome predators. And there's one that I see a lot early in the season. It's called Bembidion. It's a very tiny ground beetle. And I've been in fields where they're just, even during the day, you just see them crawling all over the place. A flea beetle spray is going to take all those out. And so they're not around to feed on insect eggs, small cutworms, things like that. So, anything we can do to reduce spraying for flea beetles certainly will help. The trouble is, what do you do? And I can't fault the agronomists and farmers for making these multiple applications because, unfortunately, it is justified. We've had discussions on this amongst entomologists recently. What do we do? What do we recommend to farmers and agronomists? We don't have any easy answers at this point. There's a lot of research on the go. All we can do is maybe try to develop a plan to help you use your insecticides a bit more efficiently, timing those sprays wisely, making sure they're made under conditions where you're going to get the most bang for your buck. Spray when it's too hot and you get too much volatilization, less activity. So right now, that's probably the best we can do, unfortunately.
Yeah, if I can just add to is even if natural enemies aren't keeping a check on flea beetle populations, and John raised that point very well, is putting that spray down is going to influence the natural enemies of other pest populations. So you could lose control of something else. And there's more on offer than synthetic pyrethroids, and rotation of modes of action if you're forced to use multiple sprays, I think is prudent.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, exactly. And Mark makes the point. The unintended consequence, right, of spraying for one thing could interrupt cycles of other things, which is really important. So for sure, I did want to mention, and Ray says this as well, gents, you guys probably have the most interesting mail out of any researchers that we've ever had on the show, because I think about what a weed science would get sent, and these sorts of things. But entomology, you guys really, you get some good mail. I got to tell you. Like you get flea beetles in a bag, and you've got midges in a tube, and look out, you got it all. Okay, we're rapidly running out of time. My colleague Kara asked a really good question here, which is really neat. So we'll try and do this quickly. How accurate do you find some of the tech when it comes to IDing insects? So along this line of the things you get in the mail, as you mentioned, so something like the flower midge, trying to figure out different gall midges, like this is years of training to figure out some of these minute details, remember them all, those sorts of things. We do see some apps, some technology coming online trying to do some of this, make it a little easier. Have either of you worked with any of them? Are they at all accurate?
A little bit.
For insect ID?
Yeah, a little bit. I think for common things, pretty good.
Yeah.
For
Okay.
for an example like canola flower midge, something that hasn't been described, they're just not capable of doing it. They
It's not
haven't got
there
the
yet.
information. Yeah.
Okay. And John, you were going to say for forensic ID, probably not.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, the tricky part with insects. Okay, just to put it in perspective, we've got 1 million species of insects in the world, and they're humongous group of organisms. And a lot of them, you need a microscope, and you're looking at things like the clubs on antenna, or a spur on the underside of the beetle, or maybe a little bristle on the thorax to tell them apart. And there's no app that's going to be able to differentiate between different species of midge, or even some of our ground beetles and things. You just can't do it accurately. So, but there are resources that are helpful. And forgive me here, Lyndsey, I'm going to do a very shameless promotion here, but there are some resources that we're putting out that can be helpful. One that we talked about yesterday, it's a guide. It's called the Pests and Predators Guide, and it's produced by a group we're called the Field Heroes. And this is a free guide. You can just go online and type in fieldheroes.ca, and you'll get the website, and you can order it for free. And what it does is it shows you it's got photos of our most common natural enemies, so predators, parasitoids, and some of our common pest insects in mainly cereals, pulses, and oil seeds. There's also another guide. It's produced by Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, Field Crop, Pests and Natural Enemies. It's a good guide too. There's resources you can gather to try to help you out, and they can help you become more comfortable with some of our more common pests. But when we get to the point where you're needing to identify, is it swede midge or canola flower midge, then unfortunately you're going to have to keep your entomologists employed and send them in, because there isn't an easy way that we can have
Right.
people keying them out in the field.
Well, no, and the key assumes that the species is even described. I mean, when we're talking about, let's say we're talking about flies. I mean, there's an estimate of 1 million species of flies. I think we've got just north of 100,000 even described. So the vast majority of the flies on the planet haven't even been described yet. So
there you go.
Yeah, that's a good point. I estimated 1 million. That million I mentioned was 1 million known species, described species.
That's right.
Estimates are that it's you hear estimates anywhere from 3 to 10 million for insects. So there's a lot that we just don't even know about yet, haven't been described.
Oh.
Yeah, until they show up in a crop somewhere.
That's right. That's right. Kevin Jed adds we should have Field Heroes trading cards. I think that's a great idea. All right. Okay, before we sign off for tonight, I did want to send one last shout out to our show sponsors, ADAMA Canada, Decisive Farming by Telus Agriculture, CanolaMaster, and the Disruptors, an RBC podcast. This fall is tackling a critical question: how can Canada help feed the world by simultaneously slashing carbon emissions? This special 3-part series features an array of experts working up and down the food supply chain, including farmers, academics, scientists, and restaurateurs. Listen for The Growing Challenge on Disruptors wherever you get your podcasts. All right. Absolutely. Jason, I completely agree. We could talk another whole hour, but these two gentlemen have a conference that they need to continue to take into. And we've also got well over 3,000 entomologists you need to go rub elbows with and talk about your favorite pests and predators. So there you go. John, I don't mind at all the shout out to fieldheroes.ca. I think that is fantastic. It's a fantastic site, and I'm going to check out that resource as well because that is pretty cool. So thank you, John, for that. And of course, Dr. James Tansey, thank you for joining me. Thank you both for joining me from Vancouver. I appreciate it so very much. And thank you, of course, to everyone in the comments as well for all your great questions and for sticking around. Head on over to realagriculture.com/agronomist to get those CU credits. I cannot talk tonight, but I am trying, and the voice is almost back. I do appreciate it. Thank you to my guests. Thank you all for joining me. Next week, don't forget, 8 p.m. Eastern, we're going to be talking about nitrogen management, and the broadcast will qualify for as a knowledge sharing event. And so it does qualify as a KSE for any of you who have got some of that off funding. All right. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to my guests, our sponsors, to Jay, my producer. Have a great night. We'll see you next week.